Testing, testing. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Jordan Sini. I'm the Youth Education Coordinator at Borderlands Restoration Network. It's my pleasure to introduce Caleb Weaver as our next speaker. He is the Community Restoration Program Manager at Borderlands Restoration Network. He will be presenting about how humans can support wildlife at home. Caleb is knowledgeable about rainwater harvesting and all those kinds of systems, and has been leading and teaching those kind of projects in the Southern Arizona Borderlands region. He studied ecology and geology at the University of Arizona. A couple cool things about Caleb is that he's really good at playing soccer, and he's really great at identifying native Arizona plants, which he has taught me a lot about. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. And thank you to everyone here at Diamond Mountain as well. This has been a really successful week, and I just wanted to take a moment, first and foremost, to thank everyone here who has helped make this possible, from leadership to the folks like Nick who helped with sound, to the folks in the kitchen and in the grounds as well. It's just been a great week. So let's show the slides and I'll begin my talk. Okay. So once again, my name is Caleb Weaver. I'm the Community Restoration Program Manager for Borderlands Restoration Network. I'm going to talk about creating wildlife habitat at your home. And in particular, I'm going to talk about how to do that with rain gardens. Next slide. So I work for Borderlands Restoration Network. We're a nonprofit organization. We're about 10 years old, and we're based out of Patagonia, Arizona. But we work on both sides of the US-Mexico border, up to about 50 miles north and 50 miles south of the border. Next slide. Along with trying to do restoration, we actually try to create opportunities for communities to have restoration-based economy. Basically, livelihoods based in putting the health and wealth back into the ecosystem instead of taking it from the ecosystem. Next slide. So why? Why do we want to create habitat at home? Well, there is just not enough habitat. There's not enough places for wild creatures to live in just nature preserves alone. If we depend on nature preserves to support Earth's biodiversity, there's not going to be much biodiversity. We need to increase biodiversity on human-dominated landscapes. Which landscapes do we have control over the most? Our backyards. So let's start there. Now, managing for biodiversity in ways that don't diminish human utility is something that Michael Rosenzweig calls a win-win. So is this a win for humans because we get to have these awesome spaces that we live in and work in? And it's a win for wildlife because they get to live there too. Next slide. So what does wildlife need to survive? Well, they need the same things that we do. They need food. This is a great example of a native plant here in Arizona. This is an evening primrose. And evening primrose are pollinated by sphinx moths, which metamorphose from those hornworms, tomato hornworm. Next, they need water. And water can be something simple, like a dish with rocks in it. So that way critters don't drown. Wildlife also needs shelter. The cheapest, easiest shelter you can produce is a brush pile home. Now, this image I like in particular because it includes all of the different creatures that can live in a brush pile home. Brush pile home, basically stack a bunch of logs and then cover it with brush. Pretty simple. Outside of that, there's a myriad of other shelters that you could produce for wildlife as well. And then safety. Trying to reduce the amount of predators, whether that's your pets. The other thing that you want to do is reduce the amount of herbicide and pesticides applied to a landscape as well. Next slide. So we could talk about any one of these four, but I'm going to focus on food. That's going to be the most complex, the one that's going to need the most discussion. And it helps build on what Francesca was talking yesterday about, which is how do we create food sources for specific critters that we're trying to introduce into our yards. Next slide. So where do we start? We want plants in our yard. We want wildlife in our yard. We know it's the right thing to do. How do I begin? Well, you probably don't want to begin by just putting that plant in the ground because it's going to take a lot of maintenance to take care of that plant. So instead, before we plant the plant, we plant the rain. This talk is going to transition pretty quickly into planting the rain talk. So I'm going to talk more about how to harvest rainwater, including techniques and reasons. And I'll let Francesca focus on which plants we want to put in the yard for those different species. Before I begin into rainwater harvesting, I want to give a plug for this book, Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond by Brad Lancaster. Well, both of his books are great. Volume 1, the blue one, is a great introduction to rainwater harvesting. And there's his website right there. Next slide. So why do we want to harvest rainwater? You know, those of us in this class, we've talked about 96% of surface water in the state of Arizona is gone. That means 19 out of 20 of the rivers in Arizona have dried up. That means that all of the wildlife that was associated with those streams and river has gone too. So if you walk around Arizona, if you walk around Tucson, what you see is not healthy. What you see is something that is the impact of hundreds of years of overuse of water. So we need to get back a little bit in terms of surface water availability, not only for ourselves, but for wildlife as well. So where is this water gone? Well, there's a few spots that it's gone, but I'm going to highlight one of the big reasons why this water is no longer here, and that's in the bottom right image there. You can see that the groundwater table, that blue line there, is dropping when we've got a well that pumps up that water. And as you pump up that water, it drops the groundwater table, which impacts the surface water too, because surface water and groundwater are linked. So as the groundwater drops, the surface water drops as well. Next slide. Well, that's not the only reason why we want to harvest rainwater. Here are some other less than positive reasons why we want to be harvesting rainwater. And these are the climate change predictions. So these are the models of what the climate's supposed to be like here in the future. More wildfires. Wildfires have been a big issue here. Probably going to be getting more. It's going to get hotter. There's this website where you can see different cities, what they're going to be like, what they're projected to be like with their current trajectory of climate change. And for example, Phoenix is supposed to get 9 degrees Fahrenheit hotter within the next 80 years, more like Kuwait City, Kuwait, unless things change, unless we shift the direction in which we're going. Supposed to get drier. And we're supposed to get more violent storms and flooding. Okay, so knowing all of that, we can try to harvest rainwater to mitigate the impacts of those things on our Earth. Next slide, please. Okay, so where does water go? Well, on average, the typical Arizonan uses just about 150 gallons of water per day. And if you look at this pie chart, you'll see that most of that water is used outside. 59%, 60% is used for watering our lawns, watering our plants out, things that aren't used inside. Because of that, my focus here is going to be using rainwater harvesting outside instead of inside. If we reduce or even drop our use of outdoor water, we can have the amount of water that we as Arizonans use on a daily basis. Next slide. Yeah, once again, 59%. So instead of, bringing water up from underground and using that water to keep our plants alive, we can use rainwater instead to grow plants and to grow food. Next slide. Now, rainwater harvesting. There's a lot of different ways to harvest rainwater. This image is great because it shows many different ways to harvest rainwater. Now, there's 2 specific ways to harvest rainwater that are kind of clumped into active or passive rainwater harvesting. Active is when you actively have to turn on a nozzle to get that water out. Passive is water passively goes exactly where you want it to go, and you don't have to do a thing. So I want you to think for a second, which of these methods here on this image are active and which are passive? And I'll give you a hint, only one of them is active. The rest are all passive. Next slide. As you can see, there's a lot more opportunities to passively harvest rainwater. And they're a lot cheaper than actively harvesting rainwater. Pretty simple. You just shape the earth to direct the rainwater where it naturally wants to go, so that way you can use it where it's needed. These are just a bunch of different ways to do it. From French drains, to gutters, to mulch basins and berms, to gabion walls, rock swales, and curb cuts. Now I'm going to show you a bunch of different methods of doing it. So we've done a bunch of these together with Jordan and with other folks from Borderlands, including Nicole. So I'll show you a few of these different projects that we've done. But the goal of this talk is really to empower and show you guys how you can do this in your own yards. So that way you can create your own rainwater harvesting gardens. Next slide. Cisterns are great. They're a low-tech way to store water for on-demand use when you need it. So cisterns are expensive. They're usually about $1 a gallon. So if you want a suitable cistern for a veggie garden, that's going to be $2,000 to $5,000. Not including all the hookups and labor if you're paying someone to do that. That's not something that everyone can afford. So I'm not going to focus on that, as great as they are. We're collaborating with the youth center in Patagonia where they're growing veggies totally with cisterns. Those cisterns they got through a grant. The other thing I want to point out about this image is those blue arrows. Cisterns can also be passive rainwater harvesting if you control where the overflow goes. So if that cistern fills all the way up, the overflow can go exactly where you want it to go and be a benefit as well. It's part of the whole system. Next slide. There's a bunch of different ways to harvest rainwater. Where does rainwater come from in your typical property? Well, it comes from all of these places. Just follow those blue arrows. And in this example, there are rainwater harvesting features that allow you to harvest water where you want it. But I also want to point out there's a few features that are hidden. Along with harvesting rainwater, you can also harvest gray water. Basically, shower water, laundry water, and hand sink water, not kitchen sink water, but hand sink water as well. Now, which of these do you think, of these 3 indoor uses, which of these do you think creates the most water on a regular basis? And out of these 3, it's probably your shower water. So again, if you're trying to get the biggest bang for your buck, what you want to do is move that shower water first before laundry or hand sink water, because that's going to be more water in your yard. Next slide. So passive rainwater harvesting can be beautiful too. Here's a couple examples that we've done with Borderlands. The one on the left, that's a before and after photo. Those are fish scales. Fish scales are basically rocks, medialunas, that are overlapping. And the whole goal with fish scales is to control flow. So sheet flow, flooding across the landscape instead of picking up steam and causing erosion downstream, slows down in a series of sinks and can infiltrate into the ground. As a result, after just one monsoon season, you can see that perennial grasses returned in large numbers. This is an effective way on a moderate level of sheet flooding, not a large amount of sheet flooding. The image on the right, this is a new home that had a construction road installed. And the owner said, I don't want 2 roads going up to the house. Can you turn the other one into a garden? So this is an old road that we diverted 3 gutters into. And now there's a series of 5 basins. And each basin harvests rainwater to grow native plants. She wanted flowers. So they're all flowering plants. This just shows the infrastructure before we put the plants in. Next slide. Okay, so that's rainwater harvesting coming off of the roof, coming off of your landscape. But you can also get rainwater off of the road. In fact, you can get just about as much rainwater as you could possibly want off of a road. So if you live on a street where there's a road and a curb, that's a fantastic place to harvest rainwater. Here's an example of an eddy swale for a backwater basin. And this is one of my favorite techniques for harvesting rainwater because you can put mulch in these basins. Next slide, please. Here's a garden that we put in downtown Patagonia with youth from Bessie. For about a week, we dug this out. We lined this with rocks. And if you look kind of in the center of the image, there's a curb cut. Basically, we cut the concrete curb so that way water that flows down the street when it's raining goes into this basin, fills up. And then once it's full, water bypasses the whole system, keeps going down the street. The very first year was a very wet year within Patagonia, and this filled up 20 or 30 times. When you add up all of the water that fills into this basin, that's a pretty significant amount of water that goes back into the ground that was eventually going to evaporate otherwise. What's nice about this is that this has a bunch of mulch in it as well. So because water bypasses the system when it's full, you can put mulch in because water is not flowing through the system. Once water flows through the system, that takes all the mulch away with it. And mulch is really important for rainwater harvest. Next slide. Okay, so we're talking about raised gardens. What is a rain garden? Well, a rain garden is basically a regular garden that fills up when it rains. Basically, it's a sunken basin that naturally collects water and stores that water in the ground. We talked about tanks, cisterns that store that water in plastic. Same idea, but we're storing it in the ground instead. This can be dirty water like the road, and you can filter out some of those toxins with grasses. This can be clean water off of your roof, and you grow food plants or native plants. There's a lot of different ways to make a rain garden. Next slide. So now we know what it is. Why do we want to do this? There's a lot of reasons. It replenishes the groundwater table. We talked about how little water there is on the landscape scale. So by getting more water in the ground, we can help refill those aquifers. We can filter water. By putting in the right plants such as grasses, we can get toxins out of waters that naturally wouldn't be pulled out of that water. We can reduce flooding. Flooding's a big issue in Arizona. Kind of counterintuitive with how dry it is here. But by having these places where some of the water goes, that means less water is going where we don't want it to be. We can use this water to feed plants. We can, of course, support wildlife depending on which plants we put in. We can sequester carbon. Plants, of course, are made out of carbon. So the more plants and the bigger plants that we can support with rainwater, the bigger impact our yards can have on global climate change. We can grow food if that's what we're desiring to do. And we can reduce the urban heat island effect by creating shade if we live in urban centers. We can also save money. Takes money to pump that water to our homes. We get water bills. Instead of spending that water on our yards and spending that money on that water for our yards, we can save money on water and on food if that's what we're growing as well. And finally, rain gardens are really low maintenance. That rain garden I just showed you in Patagonia, I've had to weed it once in the last year. That's not bad. Next slide. Okay, so if your goal is to put in a rain garden, which I hope it is, first thing you want to do is identify the catchment area. So if you're on the road, it's basically the road. You're not going to be able to calculate the whole road. So instead, build as big a basin as you could possibly want. And you can fit in that space. After you figure out the catchment area, which if it's on your roof, you can calculate the area of that roof. You can calculate the volume of how much water flows in a peak rain. Here in Arizona, the biggest rains I've seen are about 3 inches in about 45 minutes. I've seen that twice since I've lived here. So I try to make all of my basins big enough to get 3 inches of rain based on what that catchment area is. Once I figure out what the catchment area is, I then figure out the path of water from that catchment area, from that roof, from that road, whatever it is. I figure out where it goes, that water goes. Of course, that's gravity. Next slide. Then I try to identify a suitable place to infiltrate that water. That place for the rain garden needs to be relatively flat. It can't be on a super steep angle unless you want to build a terrace. It needs to be pretty close to where the water naturally goes. It needs to be away from your septic systems and buried utilities. It needs to be 10 feet away from the foundation of a building to not affect any structures near there. You're going to want to consider javelina and wildlife predation because if you're planting plants for wildlife are going to want to eat it. There's a few other things you're going to want to consider too. Can you create some shade on a building to also reduce your energy costs? You want to create shade on a parking area or an outdoor space that you like to hang out in? Can you put it in a place that's visually pleasing? Something that's really attractive, not only to wildlife, but to humans too. And what are some of the added benefits? What are some of the other functions that we can stack into this rain garden? For example, can we get some food out of there? Some medicines, maybe some herbal medicine. Maybe laundry, like soap berries, what we talked about earlier today. Soap berries are great in rain gardens. If you're going to do that, of course, you're going to want to plant it near your garden or near your kitchen or doors so that way you've got easy access using your permaculture principles with zones to try to get easy access there. And with every rain garden, you're going to want to think about overflow. Okay, if and when we get 4 inches of rain instead of 3, where's that water going to go? It's going to go into my living room? Or is it going to go somewhere else? Next slide. This is another permaculture principle that's helpful to think about, and that's passive solar design. Basically, how can we plant trees around our yard to have shade when we need it and allow sun when we need it? So do you want can you put your rain garden in a spot where you can support evergreen trees on the west, deciduous trees on the east, maybe some fruit trees on the north side of your house here in the northern hemisphere. You want to swap that if you're living in the southern hemisphere. Next slide. Okay, so I love native plants. So why do we want to use native plants? There are so many reasons. Can't fit them all in the slide. And Jessica talked all about why native plants yesterday. Go look at her slides, but here are some highlights. They're drought adapted. Basically, they're adapted to the weird weather patterns we have here. If I was to plant something from where I was born, up in the Northeast, oh, I would have to pump so much water and water that so much to try to keep it alive. Native plants are oftentimes deep-rooted. Not always the case, but deep roots allow for more drought adaptation as well. The deeper the roots, the more access to water there is during dry period. Native plants are low maintenance, fewer pests, because predator insects are adapted to eating the pests that feed on the insects. They don't need any fertilizer or soil prep. And of course, they need less supplemental water if you're choosing the right plant. If you're planting sycamore, you're going to need a lot of supplemental water. Native plants, for example, grasses, are better able to filter pollutants. And most importantly, they support local pollinators and others. That's why I like them. Next slide. When properly placed around the yard, regionally appropriate plants can survive and even thrive on passive rainwater harvesting. We can have beautiful gardens like this one here that are totally supported on rainwater. And they'll produce beautiful plants, beautiful gardens that are really effective to wildlife. Now, one other reason why we want to support native plants is because while they're beautiful to us, they're critical to the survival of our native wildlife. If we don't have native plants, we don't have native wildlife. But once again, those native plants are really critical for non-human care. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about native plants and how they are more drought adapted. Here's kind of a counterexample of that. Here are 4 native plants, all 4 of which I love to put in gardens. But each of these 4 allows for different amounts of water and needs different amounts of water based on where they live. All right, does anyone know what the plant is on the bottom right? Creosote. Creosote need a lot of water or very little water? No water. Take the water, right? All right, bottom left. What's that plant? It's a grama grass. Blue grama, nice. The blue grama grass. Blue grama grass. Little water, medium water, lots of water. Low, medium. Nice. Top right. Which plant is that? Not a butterfly bush, it's a small tree. That is an elderberry. And an elderberry needs medium high amount. Native plant that's really great for wildlife. It flowers during that critical dry period, and it produces a delicious berry as well. It's a good medicine. Look at all those functions stacked on top of each other. Finally, top left, what plant we got there? Sycamore. No water needed for the sycamore, right? Sycamores grow where there's like flowing water, just about only. So even though all four of these are native plants, I just want to underline that not all native plants need the same amount of water. So if you're going to put a native plant in your garden, make sure that you're putting in the right type of native plant based on how big a basin you're putting in. Next slide. Okay. This is a great resource for considering flowering time. So the Pollinator Partnership has created these guides for each different region of the United States. So if you live in California, there is one of these guides for you. Full of great information, but I am going to highlight this table here. And this table shows you when different plants flower. So if you're trying to get flowers, once again, during that critical time, when there's not much flowering in Arizona, May, June, when it's super hot and dry out, this is where you can look to figure out what's flowering. Or you can call it Francesca. This guide is perfect for this elevation. So I recommend if you live above about 4,000 feet, maybe about 3,000 feet in Arizona or New Mexico, get this guide because there's a lower elevation guide as well for it. Next slide. Native plants. You can also eat them. We are really lucky living here in this ecoregion because there are so many native plants that we can also eat. I think Twyla was talking about the saguaro cactus fruit and how delicious that is. It's so good. But there's a lot of really delicious fruits around here. From the mesquite to the prickly pear, to the feral cactus, the chiltepines. These are wildlife supporting plants that can also support our belly. So I just wanted to put a plug in for those. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to give a couple case studies for rain gardens that we've put in the last couple years. So way back almost 10 years ago, this is what this specific site at Patagonia High School used to look like. Gutters off these buildings would go down across the grass and then into the central, you can kind of see a grate where that water was then just taken off site. Great way to get water off site. Not a great way to get water into the ground. So the kids at the high school, through their middle school science class, designed an outdoor classroom here and then installed it. Next slide. So this is partway through construction in 2016. You can see after a rainstorm, these terraces that the youth built are all full of water. And all of that water would have just gone into the grate otherwise. David showed this project earlier as well. I'll show a pond that the kids also dug that has some native fish in it. Next slide. Watch the size of this mesquite through these images. Next slide, please. You can see the mesquite's getting bigger and the plants are getting bigger too. In the back, you can see there's a cistern hidden way in the back. And behind this little ramp, there's a little pond that is fed by that cistern as well. There's some concrete mortared benches that you've tiled, and that serves as the outdoor classroom at this point. Next slide. So this is after 2 years of harvesting the rainwater there. You can see how big these plants are and how shaggy that mesquite now is. Next slide. And then after 3 years of monsoons, it's basically a jungle. So it happens quick. Next slide. Okay, here's another case study. So how can you harvest rainwater in a barren site just after they build a home? Well, this is the before photo. Before the walls were put up, before any basins were dug, you can see that this was basically just an earthen flat expanse. Next slide. So what this landowner wanted to do was to create habitat for wildlife. That was it. That was his goal. So what we did was we harvested water off of the roof in these gutters underneath the pathway, and then connected those gutters to a series of basins. He didn't want one drop of water leaving his yard. Next slide. So you can see here after one monsoon season, these plants that we put in at the bottom of these gutters are doing pretty well. The grasses are growing against the edge of the building. By the way, grasses are one of the most important larval food sources for butterflies out there. The one species of plant that has the most species of butterfly whose caterpillars eat it are actually blue grandma grass. Next slide. So this is after 2 monsoon seasons. So just after 2 series of rains, you can turn a site from dusty barrenness to a lush garden. So imagine what this is going to look like after 5 years or after 10 years. And the amount of carbon that's being stored and sequestered on this site as well. Next slide. Here's a rabbit brush and a mesquite tree that were planted with us, along with some saccatone in the back and some elderberry in the far corner as well. Next slide. This datura plant, we planted, it was in a 1-gallon pot, and after 2 years, turned into a monster. The cistern in the back, which feeds a pond that they've got, we planted 3 tombstone rows around it, and you can see it's turned into like sideshow bobtail at the top. Next slide. All right, that's it. Hopefully this was helpful with ideas of how to install some rain gardens to bring some habitat into your yards. You guys have any questions? Thanks. Yeah, Katie. Great question. The question was, do you plant in the basins, on the sides of the basins, and how do you know which plants go where? So for the most part, you plant on the side. There are a few species that you can plant inside the basin. I can tell you which species those are. There's almost any grass you can, but in particular, saccatone, deergrass, vine mesquite grass, and Leptophilia, the green sprangletop grass. So those are really the big ones that you can plant in there. Really any grass will be fine. As long as it like infiltrates into the ground. The other plant that does really well in there is sea willow. That's another one that does great. Yeah.
So I collect all of my water, house, and we are planning gray water, like, gray water on water. But does it help to have things to confirm the date that if you don't have an extra for gray water, that you can lose from the.
Yeah, so the question was, Hayden's collecting all of this rainwater off his roof for use in his home. So he was wondering, can he also just build basins around the yard if the roof water is being used already? And the answer is yeah, depending on where you build it. So you want to make sure that they're getting full of water. You want to make sure that you're not just building basins and then they're not going to get full of water. So you want to see where on the property the water is moving around a lot. That's going to probably be near your driveway. That's probably going to be places that flood that you really don't want them to flood. And those are the places that you direct water instead into a garden. So again, from that permaculture perspective, take a hazard and turn it into a resource. But yes, I'm trying to think of a couple of examples. Yeah, so there is this person that we worked with who had water flowing down their property and into their front door. Not ideal. So instead, we built a berm and directed that water around and into a basin instead. We directed that water underground through a French drain system, so that way they wouldn't be driving through that that water. So yeah, as long as you've got a catchment area place that water's falling, you can harvest that water for you. Yeah, Xavier. So the question was, Xavier lives in a place that there's not a lot of flowering plants. His yard is mostly grasses. Can he plant some flowering plants in that area? Definitely, definitely. So do you know how many inches of rain you get there per year? Okay, so 11 inches of rain, 5 inches of snow. You get more rain than Tucson. And Tucson gets about 11 inches of rain a year. And look at the diversity of plants there. So I suggest walking around Tucson, going to some native plant nurseries, and seeing the types of plants you really love there. Because you could plant just about any of those as long as they can survive at 6,000 feet. Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was, can I plant plants that at 6,000 feet that can live at Tucson's elevation of about 2,000 feet? Some of them you can't, not all of them. So our cactus, no. Mesquite, probably. So if you go to a native plant nursery, say, I live at 6,000 feet. I want some flowers. What can I plant? The other thing you could do is look at that guide. That guide's great. So probably the #1 plant I'd recommend for you is Apache Plume. That's a really great flower, and that would do really well in your area. And then I check out with Paculisco as well. I bet they know some plants from New Mexico that would do really well as well. Yeah, there's a lot of demand. Hard to remember to repeat the question. So the question was, are people interested in this? Is this something that people are adapting and adopting in Patagonia? And the answer is yeah, there's a lot of demand for them. There's not a lot of expertise and there's not a lot of people who are doing that. So if there's a young person out there who's looking for a job in Southern Arizona, learn rainwater harvesting. You're gonna have a lot of clients. There's a lot of people interested in it, and right now we do basically design build for Patagonia through Borderlands, and we've got like 15 people on our client list right now. So there's a lot of interest in doing this type of thing. And we haven't even advertised yet. So as soon as we start advertising, more demand stuff. Yeah. So Borderland, the question was, one of the first slides of the presentation was that Borderlands focuses on a restorative economy. And how does this project support a restorative economy? If we can get people to have jobs based in sinking water into the earth, to growing native plants, to supporting homeowners and empowering homeowners to do the same, then those folks don't have to get jobs with the mine or one of those other industries that takes people in. So creating more avenues for folks to get those jobs or creating those jobs ourselves is something we try to do. Megan? Great question. So the question was, for areas that are disturbed, how do you deal with those weeds? For example, Russian thistle, tumbleweed, which is one of the big ones that we've got. So the way I like to think about weeds is from a lens of ecology, like so many things in my life that I've been subjecting you to in the last week. And because of that, weeds come in usually when there's a big ground disturbance, just like you said. Russian thistle is a great example of that. A great way to get past weeds is to help build the soil. And the best way to build the soil around here is with mulch. You can kickstart a ground disturbance, an earthquake, a flood, one of those natural ground disturbances. You can go from that to the climax community instead of in hundreds or thousands of years, in just a couple years by mulching. So for me, mulch is the best thing to use because is there going to be Russian thistle? Yeah, totally. But instead of instead of hundreds and hundreds of Russian thistle for years, it's going to be 1 or 2 Russian thistle instead. That's manageable. The other thing I try to do is I try to pack the plants in. So I try to give no opportunities for weeds to come in. And how I do that is I put grass seeds down, or I put in just a lot of plants. So that way that all that water that's coming in is being soaked up and used up. The rocks are pretty, but they also serve a really important function, which is trying to slow down that water and reduce erosion on the edges. For example, that garden in Patagonia right next to the street, it's lined on the edge with all this rock. So that way the water or the highland on the side doesn't slough off and erode into the lowland below. And it's really beautiful. Because of that garden, the town of Patagonia, we got more grants, and the town of Patagonia fast-tracked more rain gardens in town. And I'll show you videos of those. Any more questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Caleb. Tomorrow is Friday. Our next speaker at 11:30 in the morning is going to be Lisa Haynes, who is a wildlife biologist and also co-founder of the University of Arizona Wildcat Research and Conservation Center. She'll be presenting on jaguar monitoring, status, and conservation in the borderlands. Our next speaker is gonna be at 3 p.m. It's gonna be Joaquin Murrieta Saldivar, who is the Conservation Director at Borderlands Restoration Network. And he's gonna be presenting on cultural and spiritual relationships with water across the borderlands. See you tomorrow. Thank you.